Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, is there anywhere on Earth where the true, original essence of the Buddhist teaching is preserved?
What do you mean?
The Buddhist teaching has been translated over and over again, and when they were brought to their respective countries to be translated, there was no guidance on how all the texts related to each other. In many cases, Buddhism also welcomed and adapted local ideas, values, and traditions as it spread across the land. Thus, much confusion and contradiction has emerged. Is there anywhere where the original essence of the teaching flourishes, absent of these translations, interpretations, and contradictions?
I suppose it depends on who you ask. Many say that there is nowhere but inside oneself that such an unadulterated Dharma can be found. However, many others maintain that the only way to encounter such a Dharma is in the original textual versions of the Buddha's teaching.
Interesting. Why aren't those original texts the ones that are studied and taught in monasteries around the world?
Those versions can only be taught to people who can read or understand the original language. Not every disciple of the Buddha can be expected to learn it. It's a complex language, and also long dead, no longer in common use. Translation, while flawed, is much more expedient. Some still try to access that true essence by translating directly from the Buddha's language, but few are skilled in both his language and theirs.
I see. That makes sense. The perfect original version is not accessible to most. We should give gratitude to the translators whose efforts have produced work that, while not ideal, is good enough.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be discussing Xuanzang. Who is Xuanzang? What are some of his views and written works? How did they affect Buddhism in East Asia? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get to it. Who is Xuanzang?
Xuanzang was a Chinese Buddhist monk and author who lived from 602 to 664 CE. That's 664. He was born with the name Chen Hui or Chen Yi to a family of scholars in present-day Henan province. He was the youngest of 4 children, and he was a descendant of a very high-ranking minister of the Eastern Han dynasty named Chen-shi, who lived from 104 to 186. His great-grandfather, Chen Qin, served as the prefect of present-day Shanxi during the Eastern Wei dynasty, and his grandfather, Chen Kang, was a professor in the Imperial Academy during the Northern Qi dynasty, and his father Chen Hui served as the magistrate of Jiangling County during the Sui dynasty. While his ancestors are not terribly important to his life story, I've mentioned Xuanzang's ancestors' names just to say that he was part of a very scholarly family which had attained very high bureaucratic and governmental rank and had that rank for centuries. So he was set up for greatness in a scholarly tradition and or a governmental position. I speak about the scholarly and the governmental as separate, but also understand that in ancient Chinese history, these were indistinct. Governmental ranking was measured by scholarly ability and impact. Xuanzang's oldest brother was already a monk, which was very inspiring to him. Even at age 9, Xuanzang went to live in a monastery with his brother after the death of his father. From then, he traveled around various monasteries studying Mahayana and older Buddhist texts. At the age of 20 in 622, he took the monastic name Xuanzang and was fully ordained as a monk. The Chinese character Xuan means mysterious, empty, deep, and it's a shorthand reference for emptiness. And the character Zang means large or great. So his name means something like great emptiness or great shunyata. As the Tang dynasty was coming to power in China in the 620s, Xuanzang entered Chinese Buddhism at a very fraught and difficult time. First of all, although the first transmission of Buddhism to China began in the 1st century CE, it really ramped up from the 5th century through the 7th century. More and more texts were being translated, studied, and implemented. However, they did not arrive with any context, any guidance on how the texts fit together and how they ought to be used with other texts, other doctrines, and other practices. So instead of starting with the first sermon, working more or less chronologically through the Pali Canon and then into the Mahayana Canon, they instead encountered Mahayana, Pali, and newly authored esoteric texts all at one time. The Mahayana Canon was still being settled and written in, and some Mahayana texts were still being authored. We have talked before about how many texts were authored in China, but self-proclaimed an original Indian text from which that text was translated. So there were many contradictions, many confusions, and lots of issues in Chinese Buddhism. This inspired many to make pilgrimages to India, where it was imagined that a quote-unquote pure Buddhism was preserved. Many Chinese Buddhist thinkers believed that Indian Buddhist monastics had preserved this true Dharma because the texts were originally put down in Sanskrit or Pali, so to study the texts in the original language would reveal the original meaning and the original spirit of the text, rather than being removed by a degree of translation. So, like many others before and after him, Xuanzang made a pilgrimage to India in either 627 or 629. Instead of crossing the Himalayas, which was difficult and extraordinarily dangerous, he went west first. His route went through present-day Turpan, and then further west along the Tarim Basin, and then to where the present-day city of Tashkent is. It's the capital of present-day Uzbekistan, and then south into modern-day Afghanistan, and then finally into India by way of the territories of the Kushan Empire. The story of the pilgrimage is told in semi-hagiographical biographies and in some limited autobiographical passages in other texts that Xuanzang wrote. The sources enumerate how many monasteries they found, what sort of Buddhism that they practiced, and how many monks practiced there. In the western reaches of what we now call China, as well as in Turpan and along the northern rim of the Tarim Basin, Xuanzang encountered mainly Sarvastivadin Buddhists, who were studying the texts in Sanskrit. Because Sarvastivada Buddhism was included in the so-called Hinayana, or lesser vehicle of Buddhism, and Mahayana had already arrived in China, Xuanzang believed the Sarvastivadins to be practicing an inferior kind of Buddhism. Although he admired that they were studying the texts in Sanskrit, which he thought brought them closer to the true meaning of the Dharma, he thought that they were practicing insufficiently. As he turned south along the western rim of the Tarim Basin into present-day Afghanistan, he encountered more Mahayana people who practiced in monasteries whose construction is credited to King Ashoka. See our previous episode for more details about that. From there, he went eastward into India and spent a great deal of time there. He traveled all over the subcontinent, visiting many monasteries and holy sites along the way. He wouldn't return to China until 645 CE, around 16 years after leaving. The stories of what he encountered there are documented in great detail in his travelogue, The Records of the Western Regions, compiled in 646. Of note is that he studied at a famous Buddhist center of learning in India called Nalanda, and he is noted for having taken a strong interest in Yogacara Buddhism while there. That interest would consume the rest of his career. Some of you may be asking why it's called The Records of Western Regions if he's visiting India, to the south of China. And the reason is not only that he visited the western regions of what we now call China, but even the northern regions of India are actually west of most of China. If you draw a straight line from the northernmost tip of modern-day India all the way eastward, you're actually cutting China in half, and the line can go as far north as 35 degrees latitude, on which lies the city of Tokyo, Busan, and other major East Asian cities. To the south of that line, we have Shanghai, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and many more. So, though we may think of India as being to the south of China, a considerable portion of it is also to the west. Modern borders, map projections, and frameworks for thinking about these places have also influenced us to think about them differently than they were thought of in Xuanzang's time. After he returned to China in 646, carrying over 600 Mahayana and Hinayana texts, and 7 statues of the Buddha and more than 100 Sharira relics, or remains of cremated Buddhist figures, he devoted the entire rest of his life to translating the Buddhist texts and treatises that he returned with and authoring some of his own. He set up a translation and study bureau in Chang'an, where he worked until his death in 664.
What were some of his views and written works?
As I mentioned, he was very interested in Yogacara Buddhism, and a lot of his most famous work centers around it. His most famous text is called the Cheng Wei Shi Lun, or the Treatise on Consciousness Only. The text explains, compares, contrasts, and evaluates 10 different commentaries on the 30 verses of Consciousness Only, written in the 4th or 5th century by Vasubandhu, who we did an episode on, link in the show notes. Soon we will also be doing an episode where we read and discuss the 30 verses themselves. Xuanzang encountered the 30 verses on consciousness only while in Nalanda in India. He also encountered the 10 commentaries that he compares and contrasts and evaluates in his Changwei Shalun. These commentaries were written by Dharmapala, Sthiramati, Nanda, Chitrabhanu, Banjushri, Sudachandra, Jinaputra, Gunamati, Jinamitra, and Jnanakandra. The entire Changwei Shalun is his writing on these 10 commentaries. The text is 3 giant volumes translated into English, and it was the sole textual subject of 2 of my graduate school courses. It's about 1,900 pages of 8.5 by 11-inch paper with tiny font. The original commentaries that these 10 commentators wrote are mostly lost to history, but can be partially reconstructed from the quotations in this Changwei Shalun. This may be a bit of Stockholm Syndrome, but I actually kind of like the Changwei Shalun, and would recommend it to anybody who's interested. However, please note that it's not available digitally anywhere, and a physical copy, translated into English, costs about $110 US. In addition to this text, he also wrote the Bashi Guiju Song, or the verses on the structure of 8 consciousnesses. If you remember, the 8 consciousnesses are the 6 sense consciousnesses: sight consciousness, touch consciousness, taste consciousness, hearing consciousness, smell consciousness, and thought consciousness, and then awareness, and also the Alaya Vijnana. For more on that, please see our episodes on the Lankavatara Sutra and on Yogacara Buddhism, links in the show notes. It's clear that Xuanzang was a very strong proponent of consciousness-only Buddhism. However, he had very specific viewpoints on the nature of cognition, the classification of the texts, and the components and the fundamental nature of the Alaya Vijnana. From Xuanzang, we get the system of cognition experience that I've discussed before on the show. In brief, it was Xuanzang who argued that sensation is the temporary and fleeting interaction between the sense object, the sense organ, and the sense consciousness. It was also Xuanzang who pioneered the idea of bijas, or karmic seeds, which are good, bad, or neutral, and which fruit into everyday experiences. So much of the structure of Yogacara Buddhism, as we understand it today, comes from Xuanzang's work. Beyond that, he was a massively prolific translator. 650 of the texts that Buddhists read and consume today were translated out of Sanskrit first by Xuanzang or his disciples in Chang'an. Many of his translations are the basis for huge textual and commentarial traditions. In other words, commentators on sutras are using his translations as their source texts. In that sense, his work kicked off the entire East Asian Buddhist scholarly tradition that is the framework of East Asian Buddhism today. His translations were criticized by his contemporaries for being clunky and overly literal, so his texts were slightly less popular in their own time than, for example, Kumarajiva's, but they enjoyed a great deal of popularity long after his death among European Buddhologists.
How did Xuanzang's work affect Buddhism in East Asia?
He's often credited as the founder of Chinese Yogacara Buddhism, known as Fashang. His texts and doctrines have found their way into many extant forms of Buddhism other than Fashang as well, such as Chan and Zen, Huayan and Kegon, and even some types of Pure Land Buddhism. Many of Xuanzang's translations were the source texts for Japanese, Korean, English, and other translations of sutras, so they're very highly influential on East Asian and Western Buddhism at large. For example, his translation of the Heart Sutra is one of the most common and widespread versions of the text that circulates around the Buddhist world. He also brought back and translated the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra, or the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. Also, some of his disciples, such as Koeiji, went on to become very famous Buddhist scholars on their own. So he had a very impactful legacy in Buddhism. I mentioned before that his work was also popular among European Buddhologists. From 1850 to about 1920, many European scholars traveled to China and India, making use of colonial inroads, and made their careers translating or studying Buddhist texts and treatises. Many of those Buddhologists who specialized in Chinese Buddhism made long and fruitful careers studying the works of Xuanzang. The Changwei Shalun, for example, was first translated from Chinese to French in 1928 by Louis de la Valle-Poussin, and it was translated into English for the first time by Wei Tat in 1973. Xuanzang's Records of the Western Regions was first translated out of Chinese into a European language in 1858. This was again French, and it was translated by Stanislas Julien. Then it was first translated into English in 1884 by Samuel Beal. Relative to other Buddhist texts, Xuanzang's works were translated out of Chinese and into European languages pretty early. For reference, the Lotus Sutra, one of the most important sutras in all of Buddhism, was first translated into a European language in the 1850s, and then into English in 1884. The Heart Sutra was not actually translated into English until the 20th century. The 3 Pure Land Sutras were translated into English in the 1890s. So, Xuanzang's works were translated alongside landmark sutras and landmark texts in Mahayana Buddhism. That should underscore how important his work was considered and still is in Western scholarship on Buddhism. I would be remiss if I also did not mention that Xuanzang's pilgrimage to India was the inspiration for one of the most famous novels in world history at large, but specifically in Chinese history, The Journey to the West, authored in the Ming Dynasty in the 1500s. It follows the adventures of the Monkey King Sun Wukong and his 3 friends Zhu Bajie, Sha Wujing, and White Dragon Horse as they travel to India to find the true Dharma under the guidance of Master Tripitaka, or Tong Sangzang. Sun Wukong was a Taoist sage and immortal, and he was instructed to go find the Dharma by Guanyin, or Avalokiteshvara, and the Buddha himself. Zhu Bajie was a pig guy, Sha Wujing was a man-eating monster, and White Dragon Horse was Sun Wukong's talking horse, and they all were traveling to atone for their past sins and become enlightened Buddhas. The Journey to the West is incredible, and it influenced a lot of media from East Asia, so I highly recommend checking it out if you can.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Xuanzang. Join us next week where we will be discussing citations for sutras. How do you cite sutras? Why does this matter? How do you read sutra citations? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you like our show and want to support us financially, we ask that you send that generosity to people in need. For now, we recommend you support World Central Kitchen, an organization that works to feed communities in times of crisis. Right now, they are active in many areas, supporting people in the path of wildfires in America, in the wake of the earthquake in Afghanistan, Ukrainians fighting off foreign occupiers, and relieving the weaponized famine happening in Gaza. If you have the means, please join us in supporting their good work.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.